gentlemen, thank you for joining the panel. Samir, particularly based in Toronto, it must be desperately early. You're probably still in your pajamas and supping your first coffee of the day. Gentlemen, wasn't it lovely how Max didn't mention regional aircraft in all of his presentation and focused on Boeing and Airbus, and we're in a conference talking about regional aviation. Tell me how you're doing. It must be difficult for all of you. So, Michal, let's start with you and your lovely range of Embraer aircraft behind you. How's it been for the last 6 months?
Well, naturally, it's tough. It's different, but I think the real impact is yet to be seen. Our industry and our part of this value chain, we are here in the long run. The cycle is quite long, from the order until the delivery. So I think that the real estimate of the impact will need to wait a lot more months, if not years, to really assess what's going on. As of today, we still have more question marks probably than answers. We hold on to the very optimistic thought that so far we had no cancellations, only deferrals, and we are quite optimistic that the future. I'm not going to say maybe it should be bright for us, but there are still a lot of points to hang on to in terms of regional kind of opportunities for regional players. Making a short reference maybe to what Max was showing. In these days, I wouldn't focus too much on the aircraft number of aircraft delivered as a measure of success. We are in a very tough situation when kind of forcing the delivery to your customer might not be the best thing that you want to make. You want to be accommodating their needs. You want to stay flexible. At the same time, you have to manage your own cash flow, your own revenues. Yeah, so we are focusing on to find this right balance here. It's not like we haven't been affected. Every single OEM has announced already some kind of a layoffs, etc., and then cost-cutting measures. It's happening here as well. But we're kind of, for the long run, we're optimistic. For the short run, there's of course a lot of sensitive discussion, difficult discussions, but we try to stay accommodating, flexible, and try to focus on the longer term, which I understand in the next section of the panel we're gonna spend some time actually discussing the future.
Sure. So Clemente, welcome in Toulouse.
Thank you.
Lovely advert for ATR behind you, and obviously an aircraft there. How's it been for you? I mean, I was talking to Mark recently, and he was saying, it's not been quite as bad as it could have been, and not, similar to Embraer, no real loss of aircraft orders.
No, not at all. The backlog stays stable. We had no cancellations. We are managing requests to deferrals, but no, not yet negotiated. And as far as deliveries, we still have the target to deliveries to catch up between now and the year end. Take in mind that also Europe, and France particularly, has been also sometime blacklisted for travel. So we are now following Airbus way of delivering. We are trying to deliver aircraft by remote. That is quite challenging. So it's a new way of delivering aircraft. On another end, on the other tone, we can say that in ATR we firmly believe that we have been going deepening down, following all the others, and we are sharply recovering. But in both ways, we went down less than the others, and we are recovering faster than the others. And this is because the aircraft in itself is an aircraft that is so versatile, and with the lower CASK in a segment and the lower trip cost in a segment. So what you can use when passengers are not there, you can use only the cheapest aircraft to keep connectivity.
Well, that's a lovely advert. So let's leave it there for a second. Samir, I've come to you last because I thought that extra 10 minutes might help you finish your cornflakes. How are things for you guys, de Havilland over in Toronto?
Thanks, John, and good morning to everyone. Yes, it is a very early start. Sun still hasn't come up on this side, but great to be here. And again, just before we start, a great job to the AviaDev team for putting on a really, really good event already. I wish it would have been in person somewhere. In terms of where we are, so as Michal and Clemente have already alluded to, and as with all other manufacturers, we've all had to adjust to manage through the pandemic. Our first reaction in March was to ensure keep all of our employees safe. And then we did that immediately to help pause our production. We made sure that we kept our families safe, and we still have the proud ability to say that nobody has tested positive in any of our organizations, so which is fantastic. And that's the way we wanted to focus on our people first. Just going back to something that Max said in his previous presentation, North America, certainly a little bit different in the way the market has responded, but for us, as the Havilland Canada, we've managed to work with our customers throughout. We actually have slowed our production and adjusted it to match the demand, and also to ensure we are managing the people resources to continue production activities. Maybe a little bit different than my colleagues on the panel, but the customers who are in our backlog are asking us to try and deliver faster. They find that the need for regional aircraft is more so now. We can certainly talk about deliveries as a metric of success, and I would agree with both Michal and Clemente that that's not really a true measure of success or stability of a manufacturer, because there's so many other obligations in the contracts for the airlines behind it. It may cost them more to try and defer or reschedule than it is to take those deliveries of larger aircraft, obviously at a much higher cost. So from our perspective, I like to think that we're actually doing quite well in the environment. Our customers are asking for the aircraft to come faster so they can down gauge from narrow bodies into the regional aircraft. With our trip costs being lower, it's the only way to go back into the market at a lower risk. So, and it applies to all of the regional aircraft. Obviously, the Dash 8 has its attributes, but in our case, we see half of the trip costs of a narrow body aircraft versus the Dash 8. So if we can bring that lower risk and reduce the trip costs down, the airlines can start to get back into flying smaller sectors or down gauging where there are some passenger traffic that will feed into various markets and still get some revenue going. And I think that's really the catalyst here. It is between us three regional players, we've got to stimulate the market again. We've got to go back to a point where even if it's 40 or 50 passengers are moving, it's got to make some sense to fly those passengers and make some money and restart that connectivity. And going back to one of the polls, I think it was on Klaus's poll, we talk about if we do nothing, you're going to die. Yeah. But you also can't do something with a really big piece of equipment and still die. So you've got to find that module in the regional segment and work with that tool to make sure that some money is coming in, some stability is being restored. And I think that that's where we are on. We were very fortunate to have actually delivered an aircraft to a new operator in all of these environments. So TAG Angola, for example, was jumping at the bit to say, how quickly can we get our Dash 8s? Because right now we cannot do what we need to do with narrow body aircraft. Yeah. And it's a great success story because they've just restarted operations in Angola and they've lifted the restrictions this week, focusing primarily on domestic flights only, but it's the Dash 8 that's doing the job for them. It's not a narrow body, it's nothing bigger that's going to do the job for them.
So, brilliant segue to the first question I'd put out for the audience. So here's the first one. The majority of capacity recovery we have seen today has been in either domestic or regional services. Is this the beginning of a change in network structures towards regional point-to-point connectivity or merely a short-term trend? So if anyone's got a view on that and wants to answer the question, that will be brilliant.
We've got some great data on that one once we get past the poll, if you like.
That's good. Anyone would think you were prepared for this. Uri, Marla, have we got a result from the panel and the start of a change in network structures? Well, it's pretty close, isn't it? 53-48. Maybe we need to think about what the extra 1% was doing, but anyway, more to the point. I was just wondering, how does that stack up for you guys? Is that what you're expecting? Clemente, let me ask you first. Do you, as ATR in your planning, are you expecting to see, a revolution in regional flying? Is this the opportunity you've been waiting for? Is it, you know, small is beautiful, you can maintain yields? What's your thoughts about all of those points?
Small is beautiful. It's been beautiful already in the past, let's say, so, and it will be brighter in the future, if you like. Anyhow, what we are proving in the beginning of this year, that we got 3 new operators in Europe. So we got Windrose, we got Lubeck Air, and we have also been experiencing different ways of flying the ATR. I love to mention my friends of Israel flying the ATR 72-500 from Tel Aviv to Rome, Budapest, Bucharest, for passenger flights during this crisis to keep, again, connectivity. We saw also SAS using ATRs to reopen routes flown by narrow bodies before. We saw Finnair that is, it was actually flying Finnair 2 A330, 5 Airbuses, and 7 ATRs. So 2 weeks ago, and by the way, 7 Embraer 190s to admit. So we are there. We are keeping the essential reason for flying, that is connectivity, and we are doing it in every manner. So being back to your first question, are we going more to hub serving or point to point? I would say that by experience from the past, ATR has been doing everything. So as we are in a hub, we are doing point to point, and we are doing all of this because we are able to go where others are not able to go, and we are able to cope with the lower load factors. And
you guys are incredible. Every time, each and every one of you has managed to mention all of the airline customers you have. It's almost like airline bingo, I think. Michal,
we have 200 operators, so whichever example you are asking me, I will be able to provide it. So
it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
Just as a note, and I will go over. I had a big problem with my daughter during the lockdown, because she had to move from Madrid to Toulouse, being back. She was already in Toulouse, but all her staff was in a Madrid apartment. So the landlord packed everything, and I had actually her staff back by UPS. But who is flying UPS turboprop in Europe?
No idea.
ATR.
There you go.
We have ATR operators flying for UPS. So.
Yeah, well, there you go. You should have got a discount on the consignment. Michal, what about from your perspective, you know, Embraer, how is it looking as though it's become much more regional? Is that your expectation in the next 2 to 3 years?
Okay, before I throw our brands into the discussion, I think anyone who today claims he knows which direction it's going to go, how it's going to look like, would be lying to a certain extent. We are analyzing options. Just like my colleagues, we are kind of impartial to this because we have customers focusing on a hub and spoke. We have typical regional players in our portfolio and point-to-point players. The hubs are naturally under a big pressure 1, 2, 3 years from now because I tend to repeat, especially in Europe, the main reason for existence of the hubs, the profitability of the hubs, is the long haul, and without long haul demand, they face particular challenge. When we try to analyze the change in passenger behavior, some maybe structural changes, of course, it is being mentioned that maybe people want to avoid the connecting transfer to flights, crowded airports, etc. So it is a challenge, but this one, I do believe that operationally and technologically, airports will do their jobs and will manage it correctly. So I tend to agree that there will be some shift towards point-to-point, but it's not going to be something that is massive. Regional connectivity has its own as well connected to the COVID. I think it's fair to say that the sustainability debate that was already one of the key drivers will not disappear. And actually in the post-COVID, with all the governments standing behind aircraft, pressure will be even stronger. So we will face stronger and stronger competition from other means of transport, especially on the shortest distances. So yeah, we all have a job to do, Embraer, ATR, Bombardier, everyone to also answer to this sustainability challenge. I do believe that in the long run, we can we stand a chance in a competition with other means of transport, also on a ecological front. So yeah, I know it's not a very clear and specific answer yet. I tend to believe that there's going to be a slight shift towards point-to-point, but I don't expect a dramatic change in segmentation of the market. Domestic is more resilient.
You don't think that, you know, if these hubs are going to be unwound in some shape or form, and, you know, we're already seeing that at the moment, and the volumes are reducing, and, you know, the big 747, 380 type operators are going down to 350s and 777s. You don't think that will create some space where someone will say, you know what, I'd much rather go point to point on a regional market?
I don't think so. Of course, they have to be right-sized or downsized in one form or another. But I also do think that, you know, hubs are a political thing to a certain extent. Hubs are not only serving the connecting flows, but being a hub, they provide a massive benefit to the local economies. Massive.
Well, I can certainly see that in the Middle East, and it makes sense. It makes me wonder why Italy doesn't have a major hub then, given that it supports Alitalia all the time. But that's another subject. Samir, what about you said you've got some data, so I see you've been frantically pulling some numbers while we've been chatting.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to just hear Michal and Clemente's comments as well. But I think if we take a look at the hard numbers, the perspective from the European operators is shifting, even if it may be short term. And when I say short term, I think it's a 2 to 4 year outlook, depending on which forecast you're looking at. And as Michal said, you know, nobody really has the right formula here. We're all guessing to a certain extent, but effectively the 2 to 4 year outlook seems to make sense in terms of where trends are and the economic factors. But we've seen 8% of the routes flown today were previously narrow body or larger jet routes that are being right sized down to a regional aircraft. And those 8% of the routes that we see from our perspective are all new routes on the Dash 8. So previously flown by whether it be any one of the major narrow bodies. But on top of that, another 7% of the routes flown are new to our type. So in some cases, there is a rationalizing of the market itself. And, you know, we can take a look at it from two standpoints. Either there's been an increasing trend towards capacity because of the major hubs needing to put larger aircraft in with restricted slots. Mm-hmm. And therefore there's an impact to the fare as well by trying to really discount those fares to a level that's not sustainable where we stand today. But the flip side of that becomes is where we stand today, economically, there are significant impacts to the average passenger. Does the average passenger still have the same amount of disposable income to travel as often as before? And does the average passenger still have the ability to connect, as I believe it was Michal just mentioned, you're reducing the interconnectivity between initial point of departure to the final destination. Can they simplify their path from their intended destination and return back home as well? Because if you have to connect through another major hub, then you end up with another COVID test or another risk of being quarantined or another risk of actually not making it home and additional costs. So you take all those factors into the discussion, and the average passenger then has to evaluate, do they still want to take that particular vacation that might have 1 or 2 flight connections to get there, or rather rely on a regional service that'll get them more directly to their destination, still have a vacation, or even avoid the vacation because, frankly speaking, a lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of money is not flowing for the average traveler.
Absolutely.
So how does that alter it?
It's not just about all of the travel restrictions. It's about the econometric situations and everything that we see, disposable income, confidence, and all of those things, as we've touched on this morning. Let me pose another question at this point, and then we'll come back to talk about some other things. So from a business development, or perhaps today more of a maintenance perspective, what should airport business development teams, and hopefully some are engaged in this today, be doing in the next few months? Digging a very deep hole and waiting for the spring, or hibernating, developing long-term strategic relationships with their airline customers, explore new market opportunities in light of a changing market, or create first mover advantages ahead of their competitors. So we'll give you a few moments to think about that. Whilst they're thinking about that, guys, let me pose a question in all of this. We've seen some governments support their national aviation businesses through very large loans, subsidies, investments, etc. And we have the CARES Act in the US. And then on that basis, if you look at what's happened, we're seeing a situation where they're imposing requirements around sustainability, environmental pressures. In one hand, in the US, they're telling us you must carry on flying, and in France, they're saying you've got to stop domestic flying and put people on trains. I'd be welcome to have your thoughts on that. So think about that for a second. In terms of the answers, then clearly no one's got a spade, so no one's digging a hole for the winter. But I think you're right. Exploring new market opportunities is probably resonates with what Samir was just saying about new city pairs that have been found and are operating in various parts of the world. You know, there are opportunities out there for everyone. Clemente, you're sitting in Toulouse. You know, it's a very large airport, very popular, lots of low-cost airlines. How do you feel, either as ATR or yourself, about these sustainability requirements that have been put in place in your market?
First of all, this has been for years a message from ATR. If you have responsible flying, you have to fly responsibly. The way to answer is to fly the less fuel thirsty aircraft. So is the ATR, is the by AFM. You go by AFM, so it's not just an advertising. You can go through AFM for various aircraft, and you will see that by seat, the only regional aircraft able to do less than 3 liters per 100 kilometers per passenger is the ATR. And this is directly linked to the CO2 emissions. When we go, because you have been mentioning states imposing certain restrictions, then I have another example, sorry about it, but we have an ATR 72-600 now flying from Clermont-Ferrand to Orly, replacing bigger aircraft and answering to the worries about public powers and environmentalists and whatever. Is something that again could ring the bell. The same is for Northern Europe. Was for the Northern Europe before the COVID crisis. So we are able to answer to this worry, to this issue. Obviously, ATR is continuing investing for the future. Now we are investing for the 42S, so to remote, even remoter communities, for the freighter, new freighter, even for more efficient moving of boxes. And we'll be continuing investing on our product to cope in the future with more stringent regulations. Also, by improving the satellite-guided and LPV approaches, everything that will help in consuming less fuel.
So you're actually part of the solution rather than, you know, an inherent part of the problem that has been created and what's trying to be solved. Michal, what about for you? I mean, is it the same sort of thing? I mean, I get the impression there is a perception that in terms of sustainability, environmental impact and all of these sort of things, regional aircraft are not as efficient or as effective as, you know, a stonking A380 or a big 777, but that sounds like it's not really the case.
Well, I don't want to go into a licitation with my friends which one is more or less efficient. I think making a remarkable improvement from one generation to another. And each of our products has a specific missions where it really works best. I definitely do agree that we are part of, I believe, and that we are part of a solution rather than part of the problem. It doesn't mean that we need to, I'm not neglecting the problem. There are for sure some markets, some routes where it can maybe be challenged whether flying is the most optimal way to move passengers, but in its totality in the European markets, regional aviation has a very, very good value proposition and a very green value proposition if you really want to take into account all factors. Emissions, CO2 emissions is only one thing from the fuel burn, but infrastructure, manufacturing costs, and everything all together, I think we are quite strong. And we have already a very promising path ahead of us. The new generation aircraft, our family, is only now being introduced, and it can offer what we call a carbon credit growth. Yeah, it's not only carbon neutral. We are able to offer to the airlines option to increase your capacity and decrease your nominal emissions at the same time. And it is only current generation. Of course, there's another generation to come. So I think 20, 30 or 40 years from now, aircraft can become the greenest way actually to, on an aggregated level from the region perspective, way to connect people within Europe. And then lastly, coming back to your comparison with the bigger, it's not the emissions per seat that counts. It's a completely absurd way to look at it. It's emission per passenger probably that matters. So we are always standing behind actually matching the capacity to the organic demand. Of course, there are airlines who are more successful in filling up their planes, even if there are bigger planes, but it can be asked to what extent this is kind of organic and essential travel, to what extent it is stimulating. I believe we're somewhere offering the wide range of products from 70 to 140 seats, which can be organically and very naturally adapted to many, if not most, of the European markets, and you can fly very heavy load factors with the per seat emissions that are very, very close to the larger aircraft.
You raised, you said something that was very interesting there. You mentioned organic demand. Now, here is a question, and I think your opinions will be very interesting for the audience. Has the aircraft manufacturing industry been displayed corporate responsibility in the rate of aircraft production that has been in place over the last 20 years? You know, have we created a bubble that had to burst in terms of excessive capacity?
But I think it's an unfair question to ask without a representative of Airbus and Boeing on this panel. So.
Well, exactly, but it gives you a completely free shot at them, doesn't it? If that's what you think is the answer. Samir, what do you think? I mean, you know, it just, if you look at it, many of these airlines around the world are extremely unprofitable, and in an economic cycle, you know, they do not provide the ROI that is necessary. What do you think? I mean, it wouldn't happen in many other industries for such a long period of time, would it?
No, it wouldn't. And I think a lot of it is because the aviation industry as a whole is such a big machine that when it moves extremely slowly, and when it reacts, the costs associated with making significant changes do take a lot of time to implement. You know, if we step back for a moment and take a look at where we are today as an industry, just touch on the environmental question first and then back into this. This is an interesting time to actually regroup as an industry as a whole and come back to the market to clear the misconceptions that are out there. So as an example, whether the aircraft, it burns a little bit less fuel or a little bit more, or whether it's quieter or it's a little bit louder, you know, these are all things that we all understand within the industry. But the question is, do we come together and tell that story clearly enough for those outside the aviation industry who don't understand it? So if we talk about working with airports, for example, how do the airports and the airlines and the manufacturers all work together to explain to the general public that the environmental impact of aviation and the footprint is much smaller than what they believe is supposed to be better by taking a train? If you think about just a general passenger going from point A to point B, 5-hour train ride, 6-hour train ride, feels that they've got a nice cheap ticket, their environmental emissions are super low, et cetera, et cetera. But think about the footprint of that railway track. So think about the footprint of those various stations and how much blasting gets done through tunnels and what has to happen in terms of reclaiming farmland. And what's the environmental impact of that versus runway, getting up into the air with environmentally conscious aircraft and making sure that you're right sizing for this market size and then reaching your destination. Nowhere in there do we as an industry actually talk about this and explain that story as well as we should. And I know that the various associations have been criticized, but I will say sort of hats off to ERA. They've done a lot of work this year just talking about the environmental impact and trying to get that conversation going to the general public and to the governments out there. So coming back to the second part of your point, when we talk about what are governments doing in the profitability of airlines and what is the role and the interplay in the industry, we do also, and I was looking at some of these questions popping up on the webinar chat, I see that there's a question about national airlines and always wanting to go bigger and not being profitable. But what is our role as a general public in trying to ensure that the governments who are making those decisions, who are supporting that kind of business decision-making at airlines to continue to buy bigger and emptier aircraft, if we call it that, where do we come in as an industry, or where do we come in as a general public to say, wait a second, there are alternatives here that we don't need to, one, spend at that level that is perhaps not as responsible, especially in the current environment, and two, what is the environmental impact of trying to squeeze in bigger aircraft all the time? How do we work together to overcome those kind of key factors? And as Michal and Clemente have alluded to in their various comments, there's ways that each of the aircraft have their advantages. I can talk about the latest noise certification that we're the only regional aircraft that meets the new ICAO standards. So, and you take a look at a fuel burn standpoint, but what does that mean to the general public, and what does that mean to the government officials or the stakeholders at airports or the key decision makers at airlines? How do they turn that into actual decision factors, where today we are seeing effectively a bubble of larger aircraft? And it's great to see that Airbus is leading the charge on deliveries, but what are you going to do with all those aircraft that are going to be sitting empty?
Well, let's come back to that, but before we do, let's try and put it in some context. So, Clemente, from if you look forward in a crystal ball for the next 12 months and then 2 years and 3 year period, from where I'm sitting and from what you're all saying, it seems an extremely sweet spot that all three of you are potentially in at this moment in time. It sounds like you're right sizing for the market. You're able to be very flexible in the way you operate, and you've got some pretty lean cost efficiencies that you can drive. So how do you feel as ATR in the next couple of years within the European arena for the future of regional aircraft and in more routes and more services?
So I think I got lost for a while, but I catch part of your question. I think that was, how do you see the future?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So the future, obviously we are in a ditch now, altogether, the aeronautical industry. We are preparing again to surf the wave, because we firmly believe that the right sizing will be there. We have examples from current sales campaign I cannot mention, obviously, about right sizing the complete industry system, aeronautical system in the country. This is a way also for stakeholders, political stakeholders, to get aware of what is going on. And for the next 12, 24 months, we firmly believe that the ATR will be back to the level of production we experienced before the crisis.
Okay. Samir, what about you? How optimistic are you or pessimistic for the next couple of years?
I'm actually quite optimistic. I think if we take a look at just what's happening in the markets, whether we talk about a second wave of infections or just an economic decline that's going to affect air travel, in both cases, there's going to be another rationalization. I hate to say it, but we're going to see other airlines suffer. We're going to see other smaller airports potentially suffer as well. But the whole system will rationalize from the years and years of growth. You could even argue that potentially the significant growth that we've seen perhaps the last 10 or 15 years of lots and lots of larger aircraft orders is really a matter of competing against each other between airlines for a smaller market size that hasn't caught up to the capacity. And effectively now the economic impact of COVID is going to take effect. Decisions will have to get made to say, look, if we're investing in so much infrastructure support within the various countries, the various markets, there's only so much money to go around. Do we start buying more testing kits and taking care of the average person on the street? Or do we start investing in more and more national airlines to buy new aircraft that'll sit empty, or for airlines that will go out of business? So that rationalization will have to come back into what makes economic sense.
Yeah,
and that's where the regional segment is going to be really driving that for the next few years.
Yeah, I agree. And Michal, from your perspective, optimistic about this?
If you ever ask my colleagues from work, I'm not very emotional guy, so maybe optimism, pessimism is not the categories that I live by. But
I'm sure I'll go out for a beer with you one night. I can't wait for that.
But I think our narrative has not changed. Our value proposition has not changed. The circumstances have changed, and I think our narrative became much more relevant right now. It's proven, and now I have the small chance to throw a couple of brands myself. This past few months have shown so many examples of the relevance and how we can support the airlines in an environment with a suppressed demand. We have S7, who was, I think, one of the few, if not the only operator in Europe who actually managed to increase traffic year on year in August. We have KLM, who has a pretty much 50-50 choice between narrow bodies and regionals. And in May, they were using 90% of the flights were served with the E-Jet. So it is proven, it is obvious. Long term, there are two challenges. We cannot pop up the aircrafts from the production line just like this and help right now. Yeah, it takes time to manufacture and deliver and change the fleet structures. And second challenge is we have this bubble. The bubble not only of the installed fleet, but also there's above us this big backlog of another narrow bodies, which can create some inequalities or some very strange dynamics in terms of market equilibrium, prices. On top of it, you have also trade unions issues, etc. So it's not as easy. Yesterday I checked, is there any statistical correlation on the aircraft size versus the crisis and the demand level? It seems that the data do suggest that the post-global financial crisis, the average gauge of the aircraft delivery, in fact, went down. And I do expect it will happen. It will happen again, maybe to the even larger extent. I am absolutely 100% convinced that we do have a value proposition that is relevant for the upcoming decade, and this is where I will be maybe leaning on the optimistic side.
Good for you. But it seems to me it's a window of opportunity, isn't it? Because however you look at it, you know, all of those things we said about right size, etc., I think are perfectly valid. But at the end of the day, you know, as a recovery begins to take place, and I think all three of you guys with your products are in the right place to make that happen, there is this horrible spectre of 300-400 aircraft that Boeing have produced that have been sitting in car parks that are going to be flooding back into the market at some time and being, and quite frankly, a disruptive element to an industry that doesn't need any more disruption. But I wonder how's anyone able to buy an aircraft at the moment? You know, I mean, airlines must be really struggling in terms of cash flow. Reserves have been decimated. You know, you've got to pay all of your suppliers and your own products. What is the leasing market like, just as an example, for aircraft? How are those guys coping? Have you got any thoughts on that? I mean, are you taking a hit from them? Anyone want to answer?
Well, if you want to take a look how the leasing market is doing, you can check the stock exchange results of the lessors. I think they've been impacted even heavier than the airline customers, but I'm not expert on the leasing markets. We had 3 lessors on speculative orders on A2 programs, and all of them are almost practically placed. So they are not giving us hard times. I cannot speak for Airbus and Boeing.
Yeah.
Coming back to your answer, how can an airline buy? It's challenging. I mean, how do you explain to your stakeholders? You know, you have the layoffs on one hand, you have a state money, tax money placed into it, and how you buy. So this is actually the core of our job, to convince that the equation is there. If you take into equation the economics of the new generation, the right sizing benefits, the sustainability effect, it can pay off. I mean, after all, the ownership cost is only 10% of the total cost of the operator. So it's only about taking a slightly longer perspective. So I know, and we have to be very sensitive. I'm not going to be pushing airline to make a decision this month, but there is a business case for refleeting, and many of the CEOs actually, we had a chat with one of the McKinsey partner recently, and I asked what is the kind of focus of the discussions with the CEOs that they are having. Is it still the survival cash management, or maybe are they moving slowly towards thinking, how do I shape my airline to be prepared for the post-COVID world? And he did admit that the shift is now for the long term. How do I restructure and make sure that my airline will be ready for this new post-COVID world? And the decisions are part of this discussion.
Samir, I never miss an opportunity, and this is the time to start an airline if you're ever going to start an airline. You know, everything's lined up and everything's readily available. So if I come to you and say, you know, I've got a plan, I've got a vision, can you help me lease some aircraft? Could you get that done by 5 o'clock tonight? Is that possible?
We can. So as Michal mentioned, all the lessors are in a very different state. We've had a lot of recent discussions with lessors of all sizes, and certainly similar to the airlines, I think some lessors will suffer quite significantly by the end of this pandemic. But there is available capacity. In terms of Dash 8s, more than half of our fleet is back in the air, purely because of demand and the requirements to replace narrow bodies and in some cases even older aircraft for regional jets. So it can be done. There is still capacity. We can get moving quite quickly. It's interesting to note that in the current environment, we are talking to more new operators or more new potential operators, I should say, for the Dash 8 than we ever have before, because everyone is forced to rethink what can we do and how do we survive and how do we get through the crisis and make sure we still have an airline that'll support that particular market. I think the reality is that, our perspective with the Dash 8 in the past has always been hesitant in how we deal with spec orders. Speculative orders create a significant amount of pressure on the market in general when there isn't an end user identified within a very short time frame. And I think what you're seeing now, and we refer to your parking lot of narrow body aircraft as an example, there are a number of lessors heavily exposed to those aircraft. And the reality is, in the market today, where passengers have become extremely sensitive on getting on aircraft, they've also become better at identifying what they want to fly on or not. So they understand things like how quickly does the air circulate in the airplane? They ask questions on what kind of filtration systems are there and what's the distance between passengers, things that passengers never asked about before. And right off the bat, then you layer on the branding risk, if you will, of a certain type of airplane or certain experiences of certain type of aircraft or safety issues or any of these legacy problems that are happening. And you're going to end up in a scenario where the traveling passenger is going to make very distinctive decisions on do I want to fly on this aircraft, on this airline, right? And if not, where else can I go and what else can I do? And those factors become much more predominant in decision making than they ever were before.
We're coming up to time, and the guys are nudging me. I've got one last question for all of you. I'm going to offer you, each of you individually, the chance to change your existing jobs and go and work for Boeing or Airbus, selling their single aisle aircraft, and I'm going to offer you a 30% salary increase. Are you going to take that role, or do you really genuinely believe you're in the right space at the right time? Clemente, what about you? And Clemente, your boss is listening, so be careful.
For me, it's an easy answer. You know, I'm ATR, so I'm already a part of Airbus. So
yeah,
whatever they ask me to do, I will be selling aircraft. Obviously, my heart was ATR. An ATR CEO in the past say ATR un jour, ATR toujours, meaning if you are stay one day in ATR, you will stay all your life in ATR. So I marry this completely. I think that as we can enjoy our role in small companies like smaller companies like ATR, Embraer, the Havilland, we couldn't elsewhere.
Yeah, and that I think that's a very good point. You know, ultimately, whatever you do, you've got to enjoy doing it. But sometimes it's easier to do it in a smaller company than it is in a very large one. Okay, Michal, Clemente is not moving for 30%. Would you move for 35%?
I think there's a second layer to your questioning from my perspective, because, you know, only a few months ago, I was halfway there already with Boeing being interested in taking over.
Well, you were, of course, yeah. Then, yeah.
I'm not. No, of course not. I mean, you can claim that you live for a challenge, and maybe now that the selling the narrow bodies might become much more challenging, it might be more interesting. But no, of course not. I think, as I mentioned, our narrative has never been more relevant for the market than right now. So I hope to really ride this wave for the following months, if not years to come.
Okay. And Samir, I mean, given that yesterday you were telling us you've just been given an expanded territory that I think covered all of the world, I guess you're quite looking forward to that challenge, and you're happy, and you wouldn't even for 50% move to someone else.
Yeah, look, I was shaking my head because, John, that was a very unfair question to the three of us, because the reality is that, you know, at some point in time,
it's not so easy to answer.
Yeah, at some point in time, everybody wanted to sell a 747 and an A380, but then you realize, wait a second, you know, those are actually now part of the history books. You know, it's not a question of whether we see viability in that kind of a role. I think the question is simply that if you want to look at your horizon, in my case, my horizon is quite long, so I don't see how that segment will face any kind of recovery in the short term. I think we have a lot of good work to do where we are today. So whether you're in the ATR space, the Embraer space, or ourselves, there's a lot that's going to happen over the next 2 to 4 years. And this is the exciting point to work on. This is where we want to make some differences and come out of COVID saying we did something, right? So I'm quite happy where I am, but you know, we're all sales and marketing people. We never say
Absolutely.
no to a discussion, right?
Absolutely. And I think my takeaway quote is the one you've just given me, where a representative from the Havilland said, quote, "There is no future in Boeing or Airbus."
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure who that representative is, but I would rather leave my takeaway quote as go and book a flight, or go and make a hotel reservation,
Absolutely.
go and book a restaurant. That's going to help us all, right?
Absolutely. Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you in Amsterdam, just north of Toronto and in sunny Toulouse. And I thank you very much for your time. It's been an enjoyable chat, some interesting snippets. I don't think I completed my bingo card with all of the airline customers you have, but we got pretty close, I think. Thank you for your time.